All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great topic planned for today, all around the complexities of the cloud. So what does it mean, and frankly, what doesn't it mean? My name is Rebecca Martin, and I'm a business development manager here at Real Story Group, and I'm excited to kick things off. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. First, for those of you on the call, as a follow-up, we'll be passing along the slides to you, so don't worry about that. We'll get those to you. For the subscribers on the line, an archived version of today's webinar will be made available to you as a reference on our site. And then finally, if you have any questions as we move through the presentation, feel free to type your question up in the question window, and we'll be sure to address it. All right, so let's get started. So I'm really excited about today's topic because it's an important one and one that impacts every aspect of content-based technologies. The word cloud gets thrown around a lot in technology, but vendor definitions of the cloud and what it means are typically, well, cloudy. So today we hope you leave here with an understanding of the nuances of software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, hybrid, managed services, and really the pros and cons of each. So I'm not sure if you're at the point where you're considering whether or not the cloud is right for your organization, but Teresa is here to discuss the current flavors of the cloud and provide a glimpse into how Real Story Group evaluates vendor offerings on their cloudability. So for those of you who don't know Teresa Regley, she's a managing partner and lead DAM analyst here at Real Story Group, and we're excited to have her. So at this point, Teresa, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction. Really appreciate it. And thank you, those of you who've joined us already, and we have many people joining as I speak, so excited to have you here today. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to be talking about flavors of the cloud. I decided it was really important that we do a webinar exactly on this topic because I get so many questions about the topic, and really the whole analyst team at Real Story Group gets copious questions on this topic. So I'm going to talk about the cloud in general, and I'll also talk about it pretty specifically in terms of how it's affected the marketing technology space, which is where I focus. And where about half of our team focuses, and obviously I know a lot of you as subscribers are really interested in hearing about that. So let's dive right in, and happy June, everyone. I can't believe it's June 1st already. So a little bit about Real Story Group, in case you are new to us and you've maybe joined us for the first time. We do a number of things. We primarily produce technology research, evaluating the vendors across various technology landscapes, and these are the technology landscapes that we cover here on the right-hand side. We also offer benchmarking and selection tools. So if you're in the market to select a vendor in one of these areas, or if you're looking to benchmark or perform some sort of health check as far as how well you're doing with your implementation, we also offer a set of tools to our subscribers for that purpose as well. We are passionately vendor independent, so we only work on behalf of technology users and buyers. So we do not partner with or work with the vendors we evaluate. Thus, we have no conflict of interest and can truly advise our customers on what they should buy without any vested interest in what you buy. And we've been in business for just about 14 years, and over the years we've had over 3,000 customers in 60 plus countries. So we're a very international firm. We also have teams of analysts on various continents who produce the research that our subscribers so appreciate. So first, I'd like to show you our vendor map, and even for those of you who've seen it before, it's updated. So this is our brand new 2016 vendor map, and I think I'm the first person to show it. So congratulations for being among the first to see it. And we've just updated this, and there's a number of shifts on this map that are particularly interesting. And I won't dwell on it too long since today's webinar is specifically about the cloud, but we will have a webinar actually in a few weeks towards the end of June that my colleague Tony will be presenting on how this map has changed over the years. These are the vendors that we evaluate in the various marketplaces that we cover. And it's amazing, especially to see the disappearance of HP, for example, from this map, who just recently divested their content and marketing technologies over to OpenText. So a lot of shifts happening here. If you'd like a copy of this map, you can get it at the URL on the bottom, realstorygroup.com. And as I mentioned, we'll have an entire webinar on this map and the shifts on this map that have been happening over the last couple of years later in the month. All right, so getting right into the cloud. as I mentioned, I'm excited to talk about just this for half an hour. It's really come up a lot recently on the advisory calls that I do with our subscribers, and this was a sticker that. Actually, my colleague Tony saw at one of our subscriber offices recently when he was there, briefing them on some of the latest technology. And I think this one's just a funny sort of statement about the cloud and sort of people's impressions of the cloud. There's a lot of ambiguity as to what it really is. Is it just somebody else's computer? Is it Amazon Web Services? Is it some vendor that I'm working with who has a maybe a hosting facility somewhere in some remote part of the desert with a bunch of hardware that I have no idea what it is and that I'll never see. So that's really the purpose of us gathering today, is to really talk about what the different sorts of clouds are. I hope those of you in the US had a nice Memorial Day weekend. If you were in the UK, maybe you took off for the bank holiday, or wherever you may be. This was my view for Memorial Day, and I was thinking a lot about the clouds in the sky, actually, and the fact that we have so many different varieties of the cloud, even from a scientific perspective. And so, of course, as I was thinking about my technology cloud webinar, I was even thinking about the various types of clouds. And actually, in nature, there are 10 different types of clouds. And I would say in technology, there's probably 7 to 10 different types of clouds. And I think it's kind of interesting that there are so many different sorts of clouds in nature. So I had fun as I was preparing this webinar reading about actual clouds as well. I highly recommend this very interesting page from the National Weather Service. So getting into technology clouds, the reason that we're very focused on this as a firm in our research is specifically because our subscribers are very interested in it as well. And I choose to show here in one of our recent surveys that we did, this was specifically in the digital asset management space, where we see that most, or the majority of, I'll say, implementations of DAM are still primarily on-premise. So it came up that it was about 58%. And this survey data is actually about a year old. So we're planning to do another survey later in the year that's going to span more broadly all of MarTech to find out sort of what direction are people going in. But as you can see, already a year ago, we had 24% of the about 200 organizations that we surveyed, mostly large Fortune 1000 organizations, were already in the cloud. And then going forward, you can see that the percentage is going to be even greater, or that many organizations are moving more towards a hybrid model. So, but what does this mean? When we ask people, well, are you already on the cloud? That could mean a variety of different things. So here's the cloud checklist, and this is what we're going to go through today over the next 20 minutes or so. What does the cloud mean to you? Let's define that. There was a story a couple of weeks ago. I was at a very large Fortune 100 organization, and I was sitting with about 12 members of the IT team, and I said, are you open to cloud deployment models? And if so, what kinds of cloud deployment models are you open to? And here they were, 12 members of a large technical team, and they couldn't even agree on the definitions of what the cloud meant. So that's the first thing, is you have to decide for your organization, when you're throwing around the term cloud, what does it really mean? So we're going to talk about deployment models. We're going to talk about cloud-specific security, admin and management overhead, which does not go away if you have a cloud solution, and I think that's an important thing to talk about. We're going to talk about integration, extensibility, reporting and compliance. We'll talk briefly about scalability and reliability, the fact that you still need to involve both IT and business. We'll talk about SLAs, or service level agreements, and content ownership issues, as well as regulatory compliance. So we're going to go through these, a couple minutes each, and this will hopefully help you define, again, very specifically, what the cloud could mean for you, and also you'll need to decide what it should mean for you and your organization, and then get everybody on the same page, especially if you're in the process of selecting a tool that you are going to potentially deploy in the cloud. I see we've already got some questions coming in, so I will get to those at the end again. So first, let's talk about what's on-premise. What does it mean? And I'll caveat, a lot of these slides are full of quite a bit of text, but know that I wanted to be as clear as possible. And of course, you could take these slides back to your organization, and hopefully this can, again, help you get everybody on the same page about what cloud is. And again, I'm focused on digital asset management, as Rebecca mentioned, but generally you can take this definition across any sort of marketing technology, or any sort of technology you might be deploying in your organization. So on-premise, as you think about, as I mentioned in my checklist, who owns the actual infrastructure, right? Who's managing the infrastructure? So owning and managing are two different things, right? And then who's owning and managing the software itself? Okay, so that's the first thing you need to think about is the actual infrastructure and the equipment versus the software, right? And then thinking about what are the properties that I might get from this deployment model. And then I always like to use analogies, as those of you who have attended my webinars or my sessions at conferences know, I always throw in an analogy, and often it has to do with drinking. So here's another one that has to do with drinking. So when you're on premise, you're on the hook for everything, right? You have to get the hardware, you've got to run that hardware, you've got to maintain those machines, you have to run and own that infrastructure, and that's what IT managers have done for many decades, right? The software in an on-premise model is also 100% owned by you. So you have to get that software and you have to manage that software. You're responsible for the patches, the upgrades, etc. And of course, you're not benefiting from any cloud properties. And I'll define what cloud properties are as I sort of move through the different models here. So the analogy here is imagine that you have your house, you own the house, you have to maintain the house, and you want some beer, right? And maybe you have a property manager, like maybe you have a third party that comes in and cleans every once in a while. Maybe you have a third party that delivers the beer to your house, but you own it and you run it, and ultimately you're responsible for it, right? So if the oven breaks, for example, you can't call the landlord and ask the landlord to replace the oven, but you buy the oven and you might have somebody else come in and install it, but then they go away, right? That's your typical sort of on-premise installation. Now, private cloud is first version of cloud that I'll talk about. And I think a lot of vendors, when they say we do cloud, they actually do private cloud. They don't actually do SaaS, and they often don't even do a public cloud. And we'll talk about, again, the differences and what that means. So private cloud, the infrastructure, you can be managing this yourself, or it can be managed by a third party. Now, often the private cloud is a vendor's own hosting infrastructure. So in digital asset management, for example, there's two vendors that come to mind, one called Net Exposure, another one called Merlin One. They still run their own hosting facilities. So the servers, the actual physical building, they run that themselves. You can actually install the software in a public cloud like Amazon Web Services if you so choose, but they also offer you a very specific facility of their own, where you can have your own instance, your own machine, and they will actually run that for you. So it's a little bit different in this regard. The infrastructure, the ownership of the damn software is actually your responsibility in some cases, but you're getting some of the cloud properties. Now, this is sort of the technical argument that many people make when moving to the cloud, is you're going to get things like virtualization, you're going to get elasticity, you're going to get resource pooling on demand, right? And that's an example. Whereas if you have more and more people coming to your system, or you have more and more people banging on your server, you're going to have more servers available to you, right? And that's an advantage. So as an analogy would be described, let's say you've got that same house, you're buying your own beer and you're having it in your own house, but it's possible that someone else is managing it, but you still own it, right? As this is a huge advantage, if more people show up at your house than you thought were going to show up, there's like automatically an extension, so you can have a bigger party, right? And that's a great thing. And that's one of the key benefits of moving to the cloud, is that immediate advantage of being able to expand your infrastructure. So public cloud is kind of the next step, right? So public cloud is when a third party is actually managing the infrastructure. So most commonly, this is Amazon Web Services with 200 plus vendors we cover, and it's increasingly Azure, but there's other obviously public cloud providers that are out there. And the management of the software can either be you, or it can be a third party, okay? But you own the software. All these models so far, you're still owning the software itself. You're licensing it, right? Here, you get some more cloud properties, though, right? And there's some options here. So you see some ors in this cloud properties part that I've described, where you have the same sort of elasticity and advantages that you get from private cloud, but you might have a situation where you have infrastructure as a service. So that's where the hardware and the servers are in the public cloud. Pardon me, I need a drink. Or you might have platform as a service, right? So this is where You have infrastructure plus potentially database plus potentially the code itself actually living in the cloud. And here you have an opportunity to pay for it a little bit differently too. So this is where you might be shifting from operational expense, from capital expense to operational expense. So this is why cloud is so popular. One of the reasons cloud is so popular for marketing applications, because oftentimes marketing budgets are monthly budgets, right? They don't necessarily have these one-time capital expenditures that are so common in the IT budgeting world. And the marketer says, well, I want a monthly expense and I want to be able to budget for it. And so the opportunity of having that operational monthly fee that you pay rather than that one big CapEx expense that you would have in a private cloud scenario or an on-premise scenario, it's just a more consistent budgeting capability that a lot of marketers really like, or a lot of content people really like. So this is like buying and having a beer at a public bar, right? The beer is still, you buy it, the beer is yours, you consume the beer, and you're just using someone else's facility, and you've got some services, like the bartender who might even open the bottle of beer for you. It's a very advantageous model. So finally, we have SaaS, right? Now, software as a service is a term that I think gets probably the most misused when it comes to flavors of the cloud. A lot of times people use SaaS and cloud interchangeably, and hopefully by the three examples that I've already shown, the difference between on-premise, private cloud, and public cloud, it's clear that there are a lot of different nuances to cloud. SaaS is a very unique flavor of the cloud, and SaaS and cloud should not be used interchangeably as terms. Please tell everyone in your organizations that SaaS and cloud should not be used interchangeably as terms. SaaS is a type of cloud. And the reason it's particularly unique is that the infrastructure is not just managed by the vendor, but also the software is managed by the vendor. So you are not responsible for things like upgrades and patches. If you log into a SaaS system one day and then log into it to the next, it might have been upgraded overnight and you didn't have to do anything. And this is why a lot of people really like SaaS, and it's a key difference between SaaS and other varieties of the cloud. You're getting a lot of the same cloud properties that you get from public cloud. Oftentimes a public cloud deployment where you have to own and manage the software versus a SaaS deployment where your vendor is owning and managing the software is run in the same way in terms of the operational expense. But I think an important key note here is D under cloud properties, which is SaaS often means multi-tenant. And what that means is that you might be on a server with other companies, with other organizations, right? So there might be a big, powerful server where multiple companies have their assets being managed, or multiple instances of the software are running on their servers. And that's where a lot of big companies panic and they say, no, I don't actually want to be in a multi-tenant environment. And that's why they often do a private cloud or a public cloud model like in the prior column. Because they say, I want my own machine, I want my own instance, I want my own server. I don't want my stuff mixing with other people's stuff. Now, whether or not you are a purist, this is where it gets a little debatable here. Many people say that true SaaS is multi-tenant and that there is no other type of SaaS. That's still sort of debatable, I think. But oftentimes, if you hear SaaS and multi-tenant is a concern for you, if you are an IT person, then you better ask, does SaaS for you mean multi-tenant if the vendor is using that term? So just to take the analogy here to the full extent, so this is like you have a monthly contract with a bar and restaurant that allows you to actually kind of show up and hang out. And oftentimes there's beer as part of the contract, which is great. So it's like I can show up at my local bar and I get 10 beers a month. And I always know I'm going to get those 10 beers. And the next day I might show back and get a better beer than I did the day before because it's been upgraded. So it's a pretty nice model. And let's face it, a lot of the industry is going this way. And a lot, I think, of the skill set of IT people is shifting towards understanding how to support the business in a SaaS deployment or a public cloud deployment. And that's a key skill that if you're an IT person on this call, I definitely advise you to think about. Finally, hybrid. Hybrid is any combination of these things. So hybrid's very trendy right now. Everyone says, well, we're going to try a hybrid model. Oftentimes, a hybrid model will involve usually someone else managing the infrastructure, but often data and or assets, if you're talking about DAM, being actually on site. So I'm going to provide some hybrid examples so you get a sense of how this might work. And if you're going to say we're going to do a hybrid deployment, again, I advise make sure that you think really what is the combination that's right for you, right? This is like crafting a cocktail. You really need to think about do I need a third party to just run the infrastructure? Do I have the people that can actually manage and upgrade the software? Do I have the machines or the space that I need and the storage I need for the data and the assets on site? Right? Those are the questions you need to ask yourself. So let's go through what those are. Before I do, here's what I just went through summarized visually, right? So you got the on-premise on the far left where you're managing everything, right? So you got to break it into all these little pieces. So just like I mentioned, there was 10 varieties of cloud in nature. When you think about the varieties of cloud in technology, there's about 10 different elements you need to think of, right? Here they're listed. On-premise, you're managing everything. Infrastructure as a service, right? This is where you're managing the applications and the data, but the third party or other parties would manage the actual servers, storage, networking, etc. And you've got platform as a service, and this I think is where I'm seeing a lot of growth right now, in particular in digital asset management applications, where you've got somebody else who's managing everything runtime and down, but the organization itself wants to continue to manage the applications and the data. But then you've got software as a service on the far right. So this is where somebody else is managing all these other things. Now let's be clear on this. Usually this is, especially in digital asset management, this is usually one vendor plus a third-party public cloud provider. So I'll just take an example from the DAM industry. Binder, for example, uses Amazon Web Services. So you're really talking about, even though you have one finger to point towards your main vendor, remember there's the third party that they're also subcontracting things to. And we'll talk about some of the complications around that in a second. All right. Again, I see some questions coming in. We will get to those at the end. So here's a hybrid example. I said I was going to provide a hybrid example. Here's one that's very typical. So let's say you use a single system that employs multiple storage options, right? So you've got your software. It might be running in the cloud. In this approach, you might use a combination of in-house storage as well as public cloud-based storage to selectively store files. So I have this right now with a media organization I'm working with, where they wanted to keep very big files on site, on premise, so they could edit audio and video very quickly. But they wanted to back it up in the cloud. But they have the software for digital asset management running in the cloud, but they've got this hybrid model for the actual asset storage. So there's some pros here in the sense that there's less security risk. It also speeds up. If you're talking about media, it speeds up a lot of things. But cons, of course, it can be expensive because you're still running machines and servers on site for these very big files. But it is useful, especially if you want to separate security regimes or have different sorts of documents and assets available to different people in different places. So going through that checklist I went through at the beginning, let's talk quickly about security, and I'm gonna fly through these so we get through by the time we get to the half hour. Security is something that always gets brought up, almost always anyway, with organizations that are thinking about moving to the cloud. And people immediately think of it as a risk. I'm putting my stuff out there. This is something that is a logical concern, but frankly, it should be less and less of a concern for organizations, because many of the providers that are focused, especially on the SaaS side of things, and private cloud, are very focused on these matters. So you'll want to think about, okay, what encryption requirements do I have? What kind of access rules do I have? What kind of data center security do I expect? And also what kind of physical security do I expect at the facility itself? If you are going through an RFI or an RFP process and security is a concern, I urge you to answer or ask these questions and get answers from your vendor, specifically how they approach these things, because vendors are at different levels of sophistication as far as how they approach these different elements of security. So remember, even if your data is going to leave your premises and be held somewhere else, remember it's still your data. This is often a concern. If I put it in the cloud, is it still mine? Yes, it's still yours, and ultimately you're going to be responsible for it. Administration and management. A lot of people think of cloud as, oh, I set it and forget it, as if it's a chicken you're putting in the oven and that you can just show up later and pull it out and it's going to be perfect. But that's not really the case. You still need to administer your system. And when I say that, sometimes to organizations, I even got this in the same IT meeting that I'm talking about that was a couple of weeks ago, where somebody said, well, we'd like to just hire a vendor to do that. You really need to own the administration of your system internally. I can't emphasize this enough. You need to understand who the users are, what they should have access to, what their rights should be, what the security rules are. Even if it runs in the cloud, it does not take away the administrative needs and the staff that you're going to have to assign. Integration and extensibility. This is another concern when people are going to the cloud, when you need to think about, okay, I need to potentially connect different systems. I need to potentially pass data back and forth. This is where the great question about APIs needs to be asked. What are the capabilities and across what protocols, right? So if we think about SOAP versus REST, etc., these are the sorts of details you need to ask as far as if something is needed to be passed back and forth, how are you going to do that? In on-premise installations, it's easier to work around these sorts of factors. You can do more of the brute force integrations, but that's not as easy in the cloud. So be sure to ask about how these sorts of exchanges will happen. Scalability and reliability. So this is something where actually, especially with scalability, normally you're immediately going to get the benefit of the cloud, especially if you're going for a public cloud environment. If a vendor's still pushing their own hosting facility, I wouldn't necessarily think the scalability and performance is going to be improved. You'll definitely need to ask questions about that. Some key aspects to notice: you want to think about file upload performance, especially for bulk files if you're a digital asset manager. Thinking about large files like video and audio, download performance, how long it takes to generate reports can be a big factor as well, and then also sync times. So if you are going to have on-premise versions of large files and have backup in the cloud, you need to make sure how long is that going to take if you're collaborating with someone in London and you're in LA, right? So thinking about things like caching, thinking about, do they have partnerships with CDNs? Are they using some sort of file acceleration technology like a Aspera or a Signient? These are really important things to ask if you're going in the direction of the cloud. Just because it runs in the cloud doesn't mean it's infinitely scalable or reliable. We always throw out that 99.9999 number, but really all of these factors play into the scalability and reliability of your cloud deployment. SLAs, service level agreements, and content ownership. So remember, the data's still yours, the content's still yours, but the key factor here, and when I showed those 4 pillars of kind of cloud flavors, one of the things that it looks like it might all be one third party, but oftentimes they're sub-vendors. So I use that Binder example, Binder being a DAM vendor. You're going to have you have an indirect relationship with AWS there, right? You have an indirect relationship with the hosting provider. You might have a relationship with an integrator that's actually hosting the system for you or maintaining the system for you, and that's different from the actual software vendor itself. So you could have 4 or 5 different sub-vendors in your cloud mix here. So you want to think about, do you want to limit the interactions with those sub-vendors? Do you just want to work through one? You really need to have these details laid out very firmly in your service level agreements. Okay, this is just a quick view of the DAM market specifically. I'm sure that many of you on here are digital asset management people. About 2 years ago, or maybe about 1.5 years ago, we decided to segment this market specifically based on experience in the cloud. And interestingly, the ones that are in the primarily cloud-based, about half of these are pure software as a service vendors, and they've always been. But there's differences. And to use an example, WebDAM is 100% multi-tenant only, whereas some of the other vendors, such as Style Labs as an example, they're focused on Azure deployments. PicturePark will do an on-premise deployment and move you to the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, Merlin One has their own hosting facility in Quincy, Massachusetts. Wyden just moved everything within the last few years to AWS. They ran their own hosting facility in Wisconsin for many years. NetX still runs their own hosting facility in Portland, Oregon, but they'll also do AWS deployments. So many different approaches here, so many different varieties here. Be sure to understand those nuances before you jump on the bandwagon. And what I'll say about these, more pure play dams that are primarily on-premise, historically, is that they're moving in the cloud direction, and is an appropriate time to just kind of jump to my next slide, which is a spectrum of cloudability. And I use this a lot these days because it shows that there's a spectrum of cloud, right? There's not just one type of cloud. The ones on the far right are historically 100% SaaS vendors, many of them multi-tenant. And as you move more and more towards the left, it's more private cloud deployments, or it's specific instances of public cloud where maybe they're used to their customer or a third party. They delegate the management of the software to a third party who happens to have the relationship with the public cloud provider. So it's a spectrum, right? There's a lot of flavors of the cloud, not just as a concept, but also even within each individual vendor. Sometimes they're offering you various flavors. That's the case with most of the ones in the middle here, right? They'll offer you lots of different flavors, just like the ones that I proposed. And frankly, we're at the point now with not just DAM, but many of the MarTech space, where they'll say to you, we'll do it any way you want, right? And that's usually what they say. But you know what? Don't believe it. They might be able to say that they'll do it any way you want, but then do they really have the experience doing it all these variety of ways? And the answer is usually no. Usually they have experience with one or two deployment models. So don't be a guinea pig. Be sure to get the real story there. Remember, as well, as you will hear the term cloud thrown around by the larger what we call enterprise suite vendors. We've got a lot of material on our blog that I encourage you to read that's specifically about the promise of already integrated marketing clouds. This, of course, many of you probably know is Adobe's visualization of their marketing cloud. This is mostly a series of acquisitions of many, many different tools that frankly never ran in the cloud until Adobe started having their way with them. So keep in mind that they're not necessarily completely adapted for cloud architectures yet, and keep in mind that they're not necessarily all connected yet. Okay, so that's the quick overview. I'm just going to hand it back to Rebecca. She's just going to make a couple of announcements while I look at the questions, and then I will come back and answer the questions that have been posed. Rebecca?
Perfect. Thanks, Teresa. A ton of good information. So just a couple of last minute reminders while Teresa's gathering up some of the Q&A. Just as a reminder, we work with a lot of organizations to help minimize risk in selecting cloud-based technology solutions. And also we can help with maximizing the resources and assessing how well you're leveraging what you already have in place. So feel free to reach out at info@realstorygroup.com. We're happy to help. You can leverage the expertise of Teresa or any other of our analysts in the research areas that we cover. And we really break that down into two buckets, which is digital marketing technologies and then digital workplace. So just another reminder, digital marketing technologies, so that's web CMS, DAM, and marketing automation. We also cover in digital workplace, collaboration and social software, enterprise content management, portals, and then we also have research on SharePoint. So if we can assist in any way, info@realstorygroup.com is where you can find us. All right, Teresa, you ready to go?
Yeah, I got a couple questions that I'm happy to answer. So somebody asked about Office 365, which I admit I am not an expert in Office 365. However, we do have a couple analysts who cover SharePoint and Microsoft Office 365. The interesting, so Office 365 is offered as a SaaS service by Microsoft. Oops, and I was going to go back to this slide. And actually this here might help us a little bit in answering this question. So Office 365 is really sort of a simplified, version of SharePoint plus Office applications, right? And it's a service that you can subscribe to, as a corporation, as an individual, and Microsoft is hosting everything, and they'll provide support around that. But also, it can be done. Support can be provided by a third party as well. So you can have a couple different varieties there. I don't know all the varieties because, again, I'm not the expert on Office 365. But I think this would actually be a good topic for a future webinar. Since so many people ask about Office 365. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but it's really the SaaS or PaaS as far as I understand it, but I'll have to confirm that with some other members of our analyst team. I admit I'm not a fan of Office 365, so I get teased about that one. Somebody also asked, what's a security regime, and did I mean regimen? So let me just bring up the security slide again, and you'd mentioned in the questions about the hybrid example as well. So there's when it comes to a security regime here, as I use the term for different types of documents and assets, so it's really role and group management here, where as an example, in digital asset management, you might have brand-specific portals where certain people in the organization can access certain brand assets, but others can't. You might also have third-party external people being able to access certain assets once they are done or once they are market-ready, but you don't want them to access those things prior. So setting up roles and groups and then tying that very specifically to asset types or based on certain metadata specifications, that's what I meant by a sort of security regime in this context. Is what do you want people to be able to see, what kinds of roles and groups do those people have, and then sort of mapping those people to specific documents or assets. But then here, this is a different sort of, this is the actual security of your infrastructure and your software, right? So that's very different from the assets or the documents themselves. So it's two different aspects to security there. Looks like I answered the question because you said thanks. Great. Okay. So those are the two questions I had time for. We do have to end here, but I want to thank you all for attending the webinar, and we have many more webinars coming up, especially during the month of June, so please feel free to sign up for those, and thanks again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon. Cheers.